Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on something that I think has been on everyone's mind, inflation. But we're not just going to talk about the headlines. We're going to get into how it really affects different people.
Okay.
You sent in this article from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis.
Yes.
That breaks down inflation by demographics, right?
Yeah, and it challenges some common assumptions about how we think about inflation.
So right off the bat, this article throws us a curveball. It says that during the recent surge, young adults under 25 actually got hit with higher inflation than folks on fixed incomes. Now, isn't that counterintuitive?
Hmm.
We always hear about retirees struggling with rising costs.
It seems that way at first, but there's a pretty interesting explanation for that. While fixed incomes, they might not rise with inflation, they do offer some predictability. Young adults, especially those just starting out, often lack that financial stability.
Right.
They may be juggling, student loans, entry-level salaries.
Yeah.
They haven't had a lot of time to build up savings. So when prices on everyday necessities like groceries and gas, spike, it can really throw a wrench in their plans.
Okay, that makes sense. But then the article says something else that kind of surprised me. It found that middle-aged adults, those between 25 and 54, reported the highest stress levels from inflation, even though they had lower rates than those younger folks.
Hmm.
What's going on there? Could it be the added pressure of, raising a family during those years?
That's exactly what the data suggests. You think about it. Diapers, childcare, school supplies, all these expenses, they add up quick, and when prices rise, families, especially those with tighter budgets, are going to feel the squeeze more acutely.
Right. It's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
You're dealing with the price increases, PLSUSA, all the extra costs that come with, having kids at home.
Yeah.
No wonder those stress levels are high. But, I'm curious, the article also looks at long-term inflation trends. There's another interesting twist. Historically, older adults, those 62 and up, they actually experience slightly higher average inflation over time.
Uh,
How does that square with what we've just been talking about?
well, it all comes down to spending patterns. Older adults typically spend a larger portion of their income on healthcare and housing.
Uh,
And you know what? Those are two categories that have consistently seen above average price increases for decades. Healthcare costs keep going up, and housing, especially in desirable areas, tends to appreciate over time. So even when overall inflation might be low, these essential expenses, they just keep creeping up for older adults.
That's fascinating. So we see how age and your stage of life can really dramatically impact how inflation actually plays out in people's lives. But the article doesn't stop there. It goes into something even more complex. Racial disparities.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear that inflation doesn't hit everyone equally, even within the same age group.
Exactly. For instance, the data shows that during the recent surge, Hispanic households actually saw their peak inflation rate a whopping 2.5 percentage points higher than Asian households.
Wait, 2.5 percentage points? That's a huge difference? What's driving that kind of disparity?
Well, a key factor seems to be transportation costs. Remember how gas prices skyrocketed during that time? Well, transportation expenses make up a bigger chunk of Hispanic household budgets compared to Asian households. So when those prices spiked, it really had a disproportionate impact on Hispanic families.
That's troubling because it means even when overall inflation starts to cool down, certain groups might continue to feel the pressure based on what they have to spend money on. It's like there's this hidden layer of inequality that often gets overlooked.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to look beyond just the aggregate inflation numbers and actually understand the lived experiences of different groups. What may seem like a neutral economic policy, can have uneven effects across communities. Policymakers really need to be aware of these nuances.
Okay, let's unpack some more of these nuanced findings. The article highlights another really interesting point about racial disparities.
Mhm.
While black and white households experience similar average inflation rates, black households face significantly higher price volatility. What exactly does that mean?
It means that the prices of things they buy regularly tend to fluctuate more dramatically and unpredictably. Imagine trying to budget when the price of milk or bread is just all over the place from week to week.
Yeah.
That makes financial planning incredibly difficult,
Right.
especially for those living paycheck to paycheck.
So it's not just about the overall price level, but also about how predictable those prices are.
Right.
This kind of volatility would definitely hit those with, less savings much harder.
Exactly. It really underscores how inflation can just worsen existing inequalities.
It's amazing how much depth there is to this topic. We're just scratching the surface here, but It's clear that inflation's impact is far more complex and uneven than we might initially think.
And we're not done yet. We haven't even touched on the gender disparities in how people experience inflation. Or those surprising findings about rural inflation you mentioned earlier. There's still so much to uncover.
Let's dig into those next. This is turning out to be a really eye-opening deep dive.
You mentioned some interesting findings about gender and inflation.
Right.
This article points to data from the Household Pulse survey that shows women reporting higher levels of stress from inflation than men.
Right, and the difference isn't insignificant.
No.
As of July 2024, 75% of women reported feeling very or moderately stressed by inflation compared to 68% of men.
Wow.
This is a pretty substantial gap.
It is, and while the article doesn't dive too deep into the reasons behind this difference, it definitely raises some questions.
Yeah.
Could it be tied to societal expectations around financial management? Do women typically shoulder more of the burden when it comes to managing household budgets and making ends meet? It's certainly something to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It speaks to the need for more research in this area so we can really understand what's causing these gender disparities and start working towards solutions that promote economic equality for everyone.
I completely agree. Speaking of unexpected findings, you also mentioned rural inflation earlier.
Right.
We tend to assume that inflation is lower in rural areas compared to urban centers, which was generally true pre-pandemic.
Right. I remember hearing that rural communities were somewhat insulated from those rapid price increases we were seeing in cities.
That's the case for a while. However, during the recent surge, rural inflation actually shot up quite dramatically,
Oh, wow.
even exceeding urban rates at times.
That's surprising. What caused this sudden shift?
Well, remember how transportation costs played a big role in those disparities we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
It's a similar story here. Rural residents tend to drive more than their urban counterparts.
Right.
They often have longer commutes and fewer public transportation options.
So when gas prices spiked, it hit rural communities especially hard.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how interconnected our economy really is. Seemingly isolated economic factors can have these ripple effects across different demographics, often revealing unexpected vulnerabilities.
Yeah. The article also points out that while housing and rent prices are typically lower in rural areas, which, helped to moderate inflation in the past, those prices saw a rapid increase during the recent surge, both in rural and urban areas.
Right.
So that traditional rural advantage seems to have diminished, at least temporarily.
Right. And this just highlights the fact that inflation isn't a static phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, and the factors driving it can change quickly,
Right.
leading to those unexpected outcomes.
So having explored all these different angles, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive into the unequal impacts of inflation? What should our listeners really remember?
I think the most important takeaway is that inflation is not a one-size-fits-all experience. It doesn't impact everyone equally. Age, race, family structure, location, all of these factors shape how deeply rising prices cut into household budgets and affect people's overall well-being.
It's not just about some abstract number.
No.
It's about real people grappling with these very real challenges.
Exactly. And that understanding is crucial for developing effective economic policies.
Yeah.
We can't just rely on broad, sweeping solutions. We need targeted interventions that address the specific needs and challenges of different communities.
We need to move beyond that one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely. Policymakers need to recognize that a generic approach just won't cut it. We need policies that consider these diverse impacts and strive for a more equitable experience of inflation for everyone.
Well said. And for all of our listeners out there, this deep dive is just the starting point.
Yeah.
It's a jumping off point for continued learning and exploration. We encourage you to read the full article from the Minneapolis Fed. We'll be sure to link it in the show notes, and to keep asking those important questions about how economic forces shape our lives and communities.
It's vital that we, as informed citizens, understand the nuances of inflation and advocate for policies that promote economic justice for everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Couldn't agree more. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still one key piece of the puzzle we need to explore. The article touches on a new wave of research that's focused on measuring this disparate inflation we've been talking about. What exactly does that mean? And why should our listeners care about how economists are measuring inflation?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into right after a quick word from our sponsors. Stay tuned.
We're back and ready to tackle that question about how economists are measuring this disparate inflation we've been talking about. It sounds pretty technical, but you said better data leads to better solutions. What did you mean by that?
Well, for a long time, we've relied on broad measures like the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, to track inflation.
Yeah.
The CPI is basically a weighted average of prices for a basket of goods and services.
Mhm.
That represents what the average American household buys, things like housing, food, transportation, healthcare.
Okay, so it gives us a general sense of how prices are changing overall.
Exactly. And it's a useful tool for understanding, big picture trends. But as we've seen today, inflation doesn't hit everyone the same way.
Yeah.
The CPI doesn't really capture those differences in how various groups actually experience inflation.
Right.
It's kind of like trying to understand a rainforest just by looking at a satellite image. You get the general lay of the land, but you miss all the intricate details happening, beneath the canopy.
So this new research on disparate inflation is like zooming in with a magnifying glass, getting a closer look at how inflation is playing out in specific households.
Precisely. The article highlights some really fascinating work being done by institutions like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Hmm.
They're developing new data sets that track inflation for specific demographic groups, taking a
So instead of using one generic basket of goods for everyone, they're creating different baskets tailored to like different ages, races, income levels, even family structures.
Exactly. This allows them to measure how prices are changing for goods and services that are, particularly relevant to each group. For example, the inflation rate for childcare might be weighted more heavily when calculating inflation for young families, while healthcare costs might have a greater impact on the inflation rate for older adults.
Okay, I see how that gives us a much clearer picture of who's really being affected the most by these rising prices and in which specific areas. But collecting all this data is just the first step, right? What's the ultimate goal? What can we actually DO with this more nuanced understanding of inflation?
That's the key question. First and foremost, it allows for more targeted policy responses.
Okay.
So let's say the data shows that rising childcare costs are disproportionately burdening young families. Well, policymakers could then consider targeted subsidies or tax breaks specifically designed to help alleviate that pressure. Or if certain communities are particularly vulnerable to, let's say, energy price fluctuations, maybe investing in renewable energy or energy efficiency programs could help lessen that impact.
So it's about moving away from those broad brush policy solutions and towards more tailored interventions.
Exactly. And that requires more precise data. It's like a doctor trying to treat a patient without knowing their specific symptoms or medical history.
Hmm.
A general treatment might not be effective or could even make things worse. But with a more detailed understanding of the problem, the doctor can prescribe a treatment that's, more likely to be successful.
That's a great analogy. It makes me think about the bigger picture, too. If we acknowledge that inflation doesn't hit everyone equally, it really challenges that whole idea of a neutral economic policy.
Yeah.
What might seem fair and balanced on the surface could actually be making existing inequalities worse.
You hit the nail on the head. This research really forces us to grapple with those uncomfortable truths and to be more intentional about crafting policies that actually promote, genuine economic fairness. It's not just about lowering inflation across the board. It's about ensuring everyone has a fighting chance to weather the storm, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Wow, that's a powerful takeaway. We started this deep dive by asking how inflation really impacts different people, and I think we've unearthed some truly eye-opening insights today.
We've seen that inflation's impact is far from uniform. Age, race, family structure, location, these all play, a significant role in shaping how people experience rising prices.
And what I find particularly encouraging is that this new research on disparate inflation is giving us the tools to not just understand these inequalities, but to potentially do something about them. Right? It's about looking beyond those big aggregate numbers and recognizing the human stories behind the economic data.
Well said. And I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'd encourage everyone to check out the full article from the Minneapolis Fed. We'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. And, keep those conversations going.
Keep asking those tough questions. Keep learning and exploring, because a deeper understanding of how inflation really works can empower us to create a more just and equitable economic future for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about using that knowledge to advocate for policies that work for all of us, not just a select few.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep those brains buzzing.